So
yeah.
appreciate an update, really.
Okay. Well, I'm friendly with Thierry Jamin, and Thierry is a person who's not mentioned as often as he should be in this case. Thierry was the one who received the mummies in 2016 from a tomb robber who's known as Mario, not his real name, but that's his pseudonym, and his real name is known. It's not mysterious who he is. And the only reason I suppose he's not in jail is that there's corruption in the Peruvian ministry, and so there's a kind of some kind of working relationship between the Haqueros, which are the tomb robbers, and the Ministry of Culture, I would say. That said, the Ministry of Culture is not entirely corrupt, and they do take very seriously, at least ostensibly, when people take these any kind of Peruvian patrimony, artifacts, etc., outside of the country, which is what Jaime did. Thierry was very surprised and quite upset about the Jaime's press conference. A little bit more about Thierry. He's an archaeologist who lived in, he's French, but he's lived in Peru for over 20 years, something 25 years. Wonderful person, a very good friend of mine. And I trust him 1,000%. So any intimation that I've seen, and there's plenty in the press, that Thierry is part of a plan to foist a phony mummies on us. It's certainly not him. I know that because I've spent many hours discussing this with him. Now, the big question, of course, is, are these things real in the sense, what do we mean by real? And if they're not real, there are other important questions, because these things are clearly, if they're not alien mummies themselves, they certainly seem to represent something that is non-human.
Sure.
So if they're not real, when I say real, I mean
like a hoax, you mean?
I'm sorry?
They're not a hoax.
Well, not a hoax. Well, that's another question. Yeah, I mean, they could be not real and a hoax, or they could be not real and not a hoax also. But real, by real, I mean that there are the authentic, unaltered remains of a once living creature that looked basically like they do. Now, in some of the actual mummies, they have found alterations, which nobody denies, and Thierry is not denying it either. They found one bone in the arm of one of the mummies that clearly was not the organic bone that was there. So that raises the question, is the rest of it fake, obviously? But most of the mummies seem to have skeletons that are intact and consistent, self-consistent with each other. The real question for me, and I was a proponent of the reality of these things for many years, because I had seen them up close and I knew the context, and it seemed like, and then of course there were all this battery of tests which showed that they were 1,000 years old. I'm talking about the small mummies now.
Sure,
and the DNA tests were very compelling. That said that they were very remote from human beings, more remote than a fungus or a bacteria in many ways. And so that implied that there's something extremely foreign to us, and it certainly would imply that they're not made out of bones that are familiar to us. But my thinking started changing when I looked at a paper. Actually, it's a funny story how my thinking originally started to change. The theory came up that the skulls of these things. Now, I have a reproduction of the skull. Yeah. Right. This is a plastic model made from the 3D tomography, the CAT scan. It's actually fashioned with a 3D printer directly from that data. So there's no interpretation here. This is what this is exactly size and the shape. It's not superb resolution, but that you get a sense of it there.
Brilliant. Thank you.
And my thinking shifted when I was up in a friend's house in the country, north of New York, and I saw a deer skull on the mantle. And the back of that deer skull, to my mind, resembled the front of this skull. And I thought, oh, wow. Because the theory had been floated. The biggest question when you confront this mystery from a scientific point of view or an anatomical point of view is, where do they get the skull? I mean, if that skull doesn't belong to any creature, you can't fabricate a skull. You can't carve it out of bone, right? You can't 3D print it out of bone or mold it out of bone. So how in the world did they come up? Where did the skull come from? Well, it turns out that this skull does resemble quite closely the brain case of a llama skull. Oh, wow. Of course, the llama skull has a jaw structure that comes down here, and it has a ridge on the top, and it has a lot of features that this one doesn't have, but they're mostly features that could be removed, in which case that could have been either by natural decomposition or by purposefully removed from the skull. I didn't take that argument very seriously because I hadn't really looked into it. When I saw that deer skull, it struck me, wow, that kind of, wow. And then I looked into it more carefully, and it turns out there was a paper done by a colleague of Terry, a friend of Terry, who was very much part of the effort to prove that, or not to prove that they were real, but was part of the original group of people who were saying that these could be actual mummies. And he was very on board with the idea that they were. But then he finally wrote a paper with two other people in a Greek, it's a peer-reviewed scientific journal, and it compares the small skulls to a kind of alpaca skull, a llama skull, and it's a remarkable similarity. And the conclusion of this paper is that, in fact, these skulls are fashioned from a llama skull. Now, I asked Terry about that. I said, the scientist, Jose de la Cruz, who was involved with the paper, I said to him, well, Jose seems to be saying that they are not real, or that they are made from llama skulls. And Terry said that he had spoken to, I mean, it has one step of ambiguity after the next. He said that he spoke to de la Cruz and Jose, and that he said that the paper was more conclusive about them being made from llama skulls than he personally felt. He wrote the paper with two other people, and there was some discussion, some disagreement, but they ended up going with the conclusion. Not the actual conclusion of the paper is couched in some ambiguity. It says they appear to be made from llama skulls. You would think it would be cut and dried. I mean, you would think, like, how but in fact, strangely enough, this thing just seems to give one mystery after the other.
But these would still be 1,000-year-old llama skulls.
But there's no question that all the components, everywhere that they took a sample on any of these small bodies, turned out to be from 800 to 1,200 years old, so roughly 1,000 years old. So
then that begs the question: why was it the Incans? Why would they go to the trouble of creating?
Well, there's given that if they are not in fact authentic, and I'm not entirely signed off on that conclusion, because there are some actual differences between llama skulls and these little skulls that are hard to reconcile, that don't seem to be material removed, but in fact seems to be material that's not on the llama skull but does exist in the skull. So what's going on? We have the ultimate question will be in the DNA when they take a piece of the skull and put it through DNA tests. I don't think they've taken tissue from the skull, and then it would show up llama if it was from a llama.
Yeah, okay.
And I should add that the real update is that there seems to be real interest of some people that I can't name, but very, very respectable journalists who seem to have located a person who's willing to finance DNA tests, a real battery of tests that will be outside of anybody who has an interest in these things being real, like Gaia, Jaime Maussan, for whom it's a meal ticket, right? And also outside of the purview of people who instinctively reject the authenticity because they're scientists and aliens don't exist. Thing, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, most scientists are inclined to deny that these things are real because it's too fantastic a story. Anyway, so we need somebody very neutral, and I think we've found that, but that's news for a future date.
Yeah, sure.
But getting back to where were we? Llama skulls.
Yes, if these are 1,000-year-old.
Yeah, the question comes up. Okay, let's say they were manufactured, because clearly, if it's a llama skull, it's not sitting on top of a llama, it's sitting on something that
made to look like a humanoid of some sort. Yes,
that looks like this. Yeah, that's the rest of the body. Missing a few pieces. Yeah, it's very humanoid looking. So it was obviously put together. Now the question, as you mentioned, was it put together in 2015 and sold to? Well, it wasn't sold to Terry. And given to Mario to try to sell on the market, or was it made 1,000 years ago? And if it was made 1,000 years ago, that raises some real questions. Why in the world would ancient people make a body that looks like this with an alien, a head that looks very much like E.T. from the Spielberg movie? I mean, not to say that E.T.'s Spielberg's E.T. was an accurate representation of a real E.T., although who knows. But I think anyone in this era looking at these things would say it's a mystery. I mean, if they did, then the question is, why did they do it? And who was it? Was it the Incans? Was it some other culture living alongside? I mean, it was basically an Incan culture 800,000 years ago. So why in the world would they make something like that? And is it possible they made it to look like something that they had actually come across and perhaps revered?
Yeah, something they venerated.
A kind of a totem of some kind, a kind of a, in the same way that we have idols. I mean, even in the Catholic Church, we have statues of saints, and they're not the real saints, but we made things to look like saints so we could venerate them, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, those are big questions. Obviously, the biggest question is are they real? And I think that the test that needs to be made, since the skull is the one thing that seems to really resemble, I mean, very overtly resembles something else, a llama skull. The short answer is to get a DNA test very specifically, very carefully, specifically designed to find out if there is any llama DNA in that skull. And if there is, okay, we're on to question number 2, which is why, who, and where made these things. Now, I'm very fascinated by, I was really invested in these things being real. I went to Peru twice. I was down there actually not long ago and saw some additional mummies, which are not really known and I can't discuss very much about. But similar family, very obviously the same type of creature or the same type of manufactured object. And so I was very invested and very certain, because I took these DNA tests at face value. I said, well, if the DNA test says not human and it doesn't match with the llama, well, that I mean, I've always heard that's how people go to prison, right? I mean, with a lot of crude, I mean, there's no question that those people are human, but they nail it down to the individual. So I had great respect for DNA tests, but when I read this paper quite recently, I started questioning, is it possible that these tests were not done correctly, or they were skewed by the predisposition of Gaia and Maussan, who obviously want these things to be real? Did they choose certain data that they like and reject other certain data that they didn't like? I don't know, but Maussan is not a paragon of integrity in some ways.
No, I understand that, and it needs to be an independent test, like you said. People outside of it who are not invested in it and don't get not set to gain from it, I guess.
Exactly right, and
Yeah.
or not predisposed to
Yeah.
wanting. So, but then as far as the other question, I'm very much tending towards the idea that these are ancient for many reasons. One is, well, of course, I mean, if they're not ancient, then somebody found a bunch of ancient llama skulls, perhaps in some kind of cemetery where people bury, like a pet cemetery where people buried their llamas, or an agricultural place where people put their dead llamas. And they found a bunch of them, and they could, and then they found a bunch of other bones. Perhaps, I mean, the body, is this made from human bones? Are these long bones? Because they have to come from something. Obviously, if this was from a human, it would be a very tiny human. It would be an infant, wouldn't it? And the ribs are, and the spine, I've spoken to a paleontologist who studies these things, and he says the spine is not a human spine. The ribs are not human ribs, etc. The pelvis would be the second thing that I would examine, because it looks basically like a human pelvis, but actually most mammalian pelvises kind of look that way, right? But let's say that they are, let's say the rest of the bones are generally from infant humans. It is possible that somebody found a graveyard where infant humans were buried. It's a macabre thought to think of them taking these mummies, chopping them up, tearing them to pieces, taking all the bones, and sticking them together with super glue or whatever to look like an ancient mummy. And then you have to wonder, what were these things covered with? I mean, the skin was tested, and the skin seemed to be 1,000 years old. So how do you manipulate skin to wrap around ribs like that and spine like that? I mean, I don't think the best upholsterer in the world could manage that without any signs of gaps or sutures or stitching or But again, because of the llama story, and I would like to revisit all the tests, and I think it's super important that they do. But looking at it again, besides for the actual scientific biological, just from a practical anthropological view, there are, or even let's say a forensic point of view, when you think of it, if you imagine the scenario that a tomb robber found a bunch of llama skulls, which is not unthinkable, and found a bunch of infant human skulls, which is not unthinkable, and that same person had the nutty idea to take the llama skull, remove the jaw, shave this off and that off, and polish this, and and turn it around and make it look like a humanoid face, and stick it on a body made out of the bones of which is certainly not the shape of a human infant, and then somehow cover it with skin. Does that make any sense? And then here's where it doesn't make any sense to me. Not that nobody could do that. People are capable of anything. There are eggs in these things. When you x-ray them, you find eggs. But if you didn't x-ray them, you wouldn't find eggs, right? Now, I must say, it doesn't really correspond to what a wild thing to do. Why put these are apparently 1,000-year-old eggs of some kind of creature. They look like reptilian eggs. They're more ovoid than ovoid is a word that means egg shape, but they're more looking than a bird egg. We haven't been able to find out because nobody's gone in there and actually done a DNA test from the egg itself. But this is actually a model based on one of the pregnant ones, presumably, and you can see the bump there.
Wow.
That there were 3 eggs in there, and one egg which seemed to be in formation, which was about a millimeter. Maybe 2 or 3 millimeters in size. Wow. That's like going from somebody trying to make some money to somebody who's maniacally obsessed with fooling the world, right? Because those eggs would not have ever been seen if the thing hadn't been X-rayed. So if you're, let's say, a guy in 2015 or 2000 or 1990 or whenever, who decides to make a bunch of phony aliens. Now, I think it would be safe to say that these weren't made in 1930 or 1920, or because they resemble aliens. If they were made in modern times, somebody was trying to make something that looked like an alien, right? Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And so, when did aliens actually come on the scene as identifiable beings? We're really talking about the 1990s, even the 50s. They didn't really have, they just had conjecture. But the idea of the little gray is gray, like Barney Gray, maybe the 60s possibly started to be. Whitley Strieber, had that image.
Betty and Barney Hill, maybe, yeah.
Well, Betty and Barney Hill, but they described human-size beings.
Okay, right, yeah.
They were not little 2-foot things, but certainly that many people reported seeing small creatures in the past. Anyway, that aside, let's just get back to this the conjecture that these are made by people. So they put in these eggs before somehow sealing this thing up with skin. They suspend the eggs in the inside of this, so they could only be seen by an X-ray. Now, if you're trying to sell these to gullible tourists, like you would sell fake Colombian pottery or something like that, are you going to go through that trouble?
Yeah.
And the only reason you would go that trouble is you would think, well, these people are going to X-ray the thing, and then they'll see the eggs and they'll say, oh, well, it must be real because of the eggs. If they X-ray it, they'll also see that there's a bone in there that doesn't correspond to a real bone.
Yeah.
Not this particular one. You understand?
Yeah, I understand. Just a quick one. What about possible CIA making them to try and divert people?
Counterintelligence things.
Discredit the whole UFO movement.
I think it's too far-fetched.
Yeah. Okay, no, I do too. I'm just asking you.
I really do. I mean, I don't think the CIA even engages in such artisanal, I've never heard of the CIA, forging a Da Vinci or something to break up a spiral, whatever.
Right.
I don't
Okay.
afford it. I just no, that it's. I guess that's something one could think, but there's nothing about this case that shows this. And of course, the bigger mummies that were associated with the little ones, the Maria, and there are other big mummies. I have seen one. So Maria was not a one-off. Those are very humanoid looking, although if based on the skull shape, if you saw Maria walking down the street, you would look again, because she's not a normal looking human being, certainly not a normal looking Indian human being. She has a tiny nose and a huge jaw and a lot of other things that make her head is bigger than any human head. But those are, no question, those are human bodies. And I don't think the CIA is making three-fingered human. Anyway, I wouldn't go too far with that. Yeah. But the fact that these were found, okay, I'm saying found, that they were presented to Thierry, even the fact that they were presented by the tomb robber, he didn't say, Thierry, do you want to buy these for $50,000 each because they're aliens, or 10,000 or whatever. He said, Thierry, you're more involved with scientists than I am. I'm just a mafia, a tomb robber living in a tiny little town in the desert of Peru. I don't have access to scientists. You do. Would you please look at these and tell me if they're real or what they are? Actually, it was just, what are they? What are these? Do they represent, Now, would you do that if you were trying to pull off a hoax? No. It doesn't make any sense, does it? He didn't sell them to Thierry. Thierry didn't pay him for the privilege of looking at them. He was asking Thierry a favor, and he gave them all these things at great risk to himself because they're very illegal. And Thierry took them on at risk to himself because they're illegal. They're illegal, not necessarily because they're aliens or because they're even human, but because they are potentially either relics is a funny word, specimens, biological specimens of humans, possibly, right?
Yeah.
Or they are constructions by people, pre-Columbian people. And all pre-Columbian artifacts, whether it's a bowl or a fake mummy, are protected by Peruvian law, and nobody is allowed to own them. They're only allowed to be put in a museum or a university.
Yeah, which is fair enough.
There, if you don't mind me, while I'm on this attack, I think it's really important. I've thought about it a lot. What are some of the other clues that this is not made recently?
Mm-hmm.
Let's say in the last 30, 40 years. There were metal parts. Strangely enough, when they took this model from the CT scan, I don't know if you can see that, but this represents a metal plate. It came out very messy. Everything else is very true to form on this model, which is a 3D print. But this bit that represents the breastplate on Josephina came out a complete mess. It doesn't look anything like the original artifact. It was conjectured that maybe something about that metal piece confounded the CT scan in some way. That would be very mysterious in itself, but they should do it again and find out if it happens again. Or maybe it's just a screw up in the data, but the data didn't screw up anywhere else. So it's a bit of a mystery. But those metal, what I call them accoutrements, the breastplate on Josephine, you find them on, okay, full disclosure, or not quite full disclosure, but I have seen a bunch of these other mummies. And on these other mummies that I saw, there were lots of those things. I mean, lots. Like one mummy could have 5 or 6 or 8 of these metal pieces on them. Wow. They are not structural. They're not keeping the thing together. And they've been analyzed, and I think this is pretty, this is pretty dependable. I think the carbon dating is dependable because it was done by a bunch of different, none of them knew what the other were doing. They didn't know what they were testing, and they came up with the same age within several hundred years. The metallurgy on these metal parts show that it's made of an alloy which was used by the Incans. Now, you can't carbon date metal because there's no carbon in it, I mean, in terms of biological carbon. But you can tell exactly what the metals are with the I can't say that word, you know the word I mean, spectroscopy. And they found out that they were made of a mixture of copper and silver, I believe. Some of the art were made of copper, gold, and silver, which was also a very common metal alloy that they used back then. Those were more on those big hands, those discs, and several other places. But I believe these were made of copper and I'm forgetting, maybe tin, like that's how they make bronze, but a few different metals that were mixed together in a certain proportion to become this metal. Now, that would be an extraordinarily time-consuming and expensive thing. So that would mean that this forger in 1980 or 2015 would be taking presumably valuable Incan relics made of metal, melting them down or beating them in the shape of, I mean, why would they do that? Again, only reason to do that and not using, some siding from your, from your garage would be because you would assume that somebody would put it through a spectrograph and find out what so that's far-fetched too, isn't it?
That is.
It gets weirder than that.
Okay.
On this breastplate of Josephine, they found with this spectrograph a presence of osmium. Osmium, if you don't know what that is, you're not alone. My brother's a physicist. He didn't know what it is. It's the heaviest element on the periodic table. It's twice as heavy as lead.
Okay.
It's heavier than uranium. It's the heaviest metal. It's the rarest metal on Earth, and it's the most expensive metal on Earth. Yeah. Now, you would think, why in the world would they put the most expensive metal on Earth on a piece of metal that's covered up with white powder on a mummy that they're selling for a few $1,000s. I happen to know that the going price on these things is around $10,000, which is, which is kind of a random price. I mean, if they're a real alien artifact, they could go for 100,000 or $1 million, right? I mean, a dinosaur bone goes for more. A complete dinosaur skeleton would be much more than that, and these are much more exotic than a dinosaur skeleton. Why, if you're making something and selling it for some number of thousands of dollars, would you put in an extremely expensive metal? Now, I looked up osmium because this was a real shocker, and there's no question that it's in the signature of the spectrograph. And I found out that osmium is sometimes found as a contaminant in copper ore. Now, I don't know whether it makes it into the copper when they make copper wire out of it, whether there's a bit of osmium because it was in the ore, but it's a contaminant of the ore. So I thought, okay, and it does occur in South America, so maybe this is a contamination that just happens to be in this piece of. But I asked Terry about it, and he said, William, they found points of osmium, pure osmium, in a symmetrical pattern on this thing. Now that, you could buy about a pinhead's worth of osmium for a couple $100 on the internet, but that doesn't fit into the scenario of a modern forgery. So
no. Okay.
So there you go.
Well, wouldn't that possibly point to possible extraterrestrial origin if maybe it's common elsewhere in the universe?
Well, it's not like there's a lot of it in these things, and it was only found in one of these. And I would imagine osmium, like gold, is one of those metals. It's actually in the platinum group, and you know that metals, heavy metals I mean, I don't know if it's called a heavy metal, but metals like gold and platinum are formed from supernovas.
Yeah, so
they are inherently not common on planets. There is apparently an asteroid they've discovered that's made out of solid gold and platinum stuff, but that's a very particular. I mean, that's a nugget in space, but I don't think I don't think we can assume that it's from another planet. No, because of the osmium. What would make it from another planet if there were any isotopes of these minerals or metals that were foreign? And as far as I know, I don't know that there have been tests of the isotopes. That would indicate it's from an extraterrestrial. But I will tell you, I never, even when I thought these things were not human and naturally occurring, I did not think that they flew down in a saucer and landed on Earth recently, or even 1,000 years ago, because and there's another thing, according to some of the doctors that examined these things, the leg bones, the long bones on these things were suffering from osteoporosis. Now that's very interesting because children don't develop osteoporosis. I mean, I looked that up too. It's extraordinarily rare. And these doctors were saying, yeah, these are real bones. They even have osteoporosis, so so it would seem to me that these creatures, if they did exist, or even if the leg bones are from an anomalous creature, they were suffering. They were not, pristine and, they lived a hard life, let's say.
Sure. Okay, so where are we up to? On the balance of probabilities, they're probably 1,000 years old.
I think we can say with assurance that they're 1,000 years old. I mean that the parts are 1,000 years old.
1,000.
Probability right now, to me, could be proved wrong, is that they were constructed, if they were constructed 1,000 years ago. And then
I guess my last question, because we're kind of running out of time, is for what purpose then, if they're constructed? If the Incans constructed them for veneration, why in this image?
Precisely. Yeah. And why would they be associated then with these? Because if they are genuine, in the sense that they are genuine artifacts, and they're found with these human-looking mummies, which are 2,000 years old, by the way, now we're talking about something strange indeed. I mean, can you imagine finding a cemetery that, I mean, maybe in Europe there are some cemeteries that have been used continuously for 1,000 years, but it's hard to imagine the same facility being used. So it's really a mystery. Now, the simplest answer is that they're modern fakes, because then that disposes of all the other questions. But again, to my mind, the evidence suggests otherwise. So
and there's still a small possibility that they could be extraterrestrial, but
extraterrestrial or something that evolved on Earth from even before humans, let's say.
But there could be it could be some sort of remnants of an ancient civilization, maybe.
Indeed. I can tell you a funny story. Do we have time for a quick?
We've got 3 minutes.
Okay. I took this model that I have to Contact in the Desert, which was one of the big UFO conference. And I met a woman there who claims she's with an organization which claims to be in contact with aliens. And, you know, many people would say, well, that's nonsense. But let's just say that I found her credible. And since I am 100% sure that aliens exist, it's not impossible that there are people that communicate with them. I showed her this model, and without blinking an eye, she said, "Oh, I know what they are. Those are the that's a Montauk." I said, "A Montauk, like the Montauk
Project."
Well, the Montauk Project is known, but it's a town in Long Island, at the very end of Long Island, New York State, which is named after the Montauk Indians. I said, like the Montauk Indians. And she said, the Montauk Indians named their people after these beings. And she went on to tell me all about these things without batting an eye. And the other 5 people in her group were just sitting there nodding like this, like, yep. They weren't saying, what are you talking about? You know, so either she was a really fantastic liar who was just spinning shit out of her mind, or maybe she knows something. But, you know, again, I love this. I used to think, well, if they turn out to be fake, I'm going to feel ripped off and disappointed. But it's just a wonderful mystery. So I hope your listeners enjoy it as much as I do.
Yeah.